So Good Cop is gunned down, and then they rebuild him into a cyborg. I'm John Chang with Dead Endmans, and that's the story of Robocop. And yeah, so I thought that this time around, one of the things that we've talked about in other episodes is this idea of how the films really are a reflection of the times. And
Yeah.
I was thinking about how, like, different times, besides the special effects and everything, how do you kind of do that without being dated? Like kind of how some movies don't age very well and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, Robocop is pretty careful in that respect. There's not a lot of obvious product placement. I mean, the effects obviously are going to date to some degree, but they're done to such. I mean, obviously they're practical effects by Rob Bottin, no less, I believe, from The Thing,
Yep.
and they're very effective and really quite good even into this day. I'd say the only thing that really stand out are the sort of the blood spatters of when people are getting shot. Those are pretty ridiculous now. But yeah, I mean, they're pretty careful in most of the branding is the fictional branding. The cars aren't any kind of noticeable brand from the time. There's a lot of effort that's been gone into kind of hiding all sort of traces of the time. I mean, it's not even. I don't even remember spotting many CRT monitors, even except for maybe the ones in the lab.
Right.
And you could argue that in the future they need that high response time of a CRT. You know, that the LEDs and OLEDs, they don't quite give you the microsecond response time. I don't know. I'm making that up. But and yeah, so in fact, if anything, the real world stuff hasn't dated. But it's the technological part that's the bit that's dated in the heads-up displays and some of the other bits. But,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought overall, like at least in RoboCop, just the fact of using stop motion, I felt like it wasn't as much of a liability. I think in this case, it was actually the way different things, the times they used it. Like for of course the 209 and stuff. It really added to the look of kind of like how you would imagine this kind of robot would kind of move and everything. It seemed very natural or organic to the actual character, I guess, if you will. And otherwise than that, like the certainly we'll get more into about how like it's definitely clearly an 80s film, and that's a huge part of RoboCop as well. But I think other than that, with movies in general, I think the challenge that they have is the relevance of the ideas and the themes and stuff. And here again, Paul Verhoeven really, I think what happened was that he initially tossed the script aside because he thought like, oh, it's a silly, kind of kid movie and stuff like that. But then, his wife apparently convinced him to kind of pick it back up. This is a funny kind of parallel story. Something similar happened with Stephen King, and I'm sure there's probably other filmmakers who have had similar kind of things where like the wife actually like said, hey, actually you may want to take a second look and stuff.
Behind every great man, it's like those script changes for Star Wars and things like that.
That too, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting about her assessment was that there were lots of layers to this story that weren't initially there. And I think there is a lot of truth in that. There's actually a lot of different ways you can interpret Robocop in many different sort of ways. I mean, we can go through them, but I mean, there's, there was a video of Maggie May Fishes, which I thought was really interesting, which is this idea of, is Robocop a transgender icon? It's this idea that, he's struggling to find his identity, and he's sort of given this body of a kind of a hyper male role model, but is kind of he's desperately kind of conflicted about all of that, which I thought was really interesting. There's also the fact that people say this is a resurrection story. Someone gets gunned down and then he's resurrected by technology, and he even walks on water at the end of the movie. So there's that. I mean, of course he's a gun-toting Jesus there. He's definitely reading from the Gospel of Saint Marksman and in this story. And I mean, there's also the weird thing of his development from when he is kind of reborn. I mean, he's eating baby food He starts off completely
right.
immobile. He can't talk, and he has to learn how to see. And then he learns actually how to become human, and, you know, learns how to sort of, again, like a toddler would, challenge his sort of patriarchal authority, which in this case is the corporation. So there's a lot of different sort of ways you can read it. I mean, of course, you can just read it as a satire on corporate culture in the 80s, on the problems with law enforcement and you know, massive sort of problems with crime in centers where, you know, these things aren't dealt with effectively. There's so, it's funny because it's seemed like a really cheesy, ultra gory, you know, toy vehicle, but that's really not the case at all. It's got a lot of depth to it, I think.
Yeah, and the thing also with Paul Verhoeven is before this, he had done mostly the art house type of films. So it's interesting for him to kind of like that. This was the first kind of which we'll be getting into of his kind of foray into sci-fi, and because the next film that we'll be discussing is Total Recall, and so he kind of continues that, and then it goes on into Starship Troopers, where for some reason he kind of picks up on how it's really a vehicle for him to use satire and also kind of really look at kind of either kind of more contemporary issues in a kind of if with a very interesting lens, like kind of, I mean, again,
Totally.
it goes back to that, like we've talked about this before, but I think it's interesting for somebody like, Verhoeven, who he, like has a very kind of, let's kind of dive more into it about like his way of looking at it, like you kind of poured out that like he does have this kind of way of like kind of really using symbolism, because that resurrection idea, he literally said in an interview that he considers Robocop an American Jesus. I mean, he it's not us making this up, like of like kind of reading into it. He literally talks about it, that being like kind of that he wanted the resurrection to be something really graphic and really kind of showing like something that like is similar to the crucifixion of Christ and stuff.
Well, this is the thing that a lot of people forget about Paul Verhoeven. When you look at like a kind of a gory sci-fi movie, you forget this guy has a PhD, and he did he was in studied religion. I think it's so. He's obviously highly aware of the effectiveness of violence and sex in storytelling and how effective it is from a religious basis. And there's no wonder that he incorporates these themes into his movies. And I mean, it reminds me of another director, Martin Scorcese, who was going to be a priest, but then turned out to be a film director. There's a very strong link between sort of religious symbolism and messages. And I mean, for me, Paul Verhoeven has a lot of interesting kind of hallmarks in his movies. There's often sex, but it's gratuitous, but it's not romantic or sexy. It's portrayed in this way that's very kind of, really sort of uncomfortable almost, and kind of like in your face and uncompromising in a way. And the same goes for the violence. It's gratuitous, but it's not glorified. Most of the people that are doling out the violence are often not really, they don't really have much agency or control. And that's another big sort of theme of his, is who's in control a lot of the times. Is a lot of his movies focus around, and it's rarely that the main characters are in control. It's always like there's a corporation or someone else manipulating someone else in his movies. So those are always, those are the sort of things I've always sort of pulled out of his movies. So.
Yeah, I mean, that's of course like kind of one of the big themes in Robocop, is this idea of the corporation, like you said, of being like kind of this parental organization, and also like kind of like literally the one character is called the old man, like kind of so here we have kind of like this divine father figures like that, who's the one that's like kind of the head of the corporation. And it's in a way like so I think what's funny is, on the one hand, as you said, with Paul Verhoeven having a religious background, he also seems to kind of just basically show that this kind of cynicism, like kind of towards religion, as an establishment that like, organizes things, and like kind of that like it almost in a way, because if the corporation is in fact like kind of this church, if you will, that's, you know, like a, kind of the organization of religion, then very much, you know, it's at odds with this, you know, this Christ figure, right? This savior and stuff. Then, you know, because it's trying to dominate, you know, RoboCop. You know, like Murphy, you know, like, oh, once he's changed, he's kind of quote unquote property of the corporation. Like, you know, or even like even before that, you know, kind of like they were saying that, you know, like they can do whatever with him because he's already property and stuff like that. And that's interesting too. That like you know, that people, you know, as we talked about before, are seen as not as like, you know, individuals or human lives, but just assets for like kind of, you know, the balance sheet and stuff.
Well, I think that's the one of the big sort of messages of this movie is like when corporations are given sort of free control, humans bear the cost of keeping the efficiency and the profits in check. And in old Detroit, it's a pretty heavy cost, judging by the body count of this movie, you know, to keep those things going.
Right.
And I mean, there's also the fact that, you know, the corporation is in control the entire time in the movie. It's only by him firing Dick Jones that RoboCop can have his revenge. You know, as ultimately it is a revenge story, but I mean, it's all enabled through the corporation. And so the sort of smiling and I'm Murphy at the end is all kind of very bittersweet because, you know, nothing is really, you know, I mean, in a way it's quite clever because it means you can make lots of sequels, but it also kind of means there's no real victory. And that's the case, I would say. I mean, for me, Starship Troopers is the closest kind of spiritual successor to RoboCop because it has the adverts and its focuses on sort of violence and things like this. And there's a similar thing in that. It's like there's no real, you know, you don't really feel like anything is going to get any better after the end of that movie. So yeah. I mean,
and that's also an interesting point though, because in the script, as you know, you and I kind of talked offline about how we kind of use the script or read the script as part of, you know, preparing for today's discussion. In the script, they have the massacre happening first, and you know, one that, you know, Murphy's not involved with and stuff like that. But in this one, they use the news, you know, kind of like you feel like you just turned on your TV and you know, you have the newscast, and then, you know, you also see like one of those kind of joke ads and stuff like that. And so you right away get a sampling of, you know, kind of Paul Verhoeven's kind of take on, you know, well, it's both in the script, but also it's interesting that Paul Verhoeven chooses to put that first though, and like where that's kind of like our gateway into this world.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a very interesting change, and I think as well the fact that the adverts are more satirical and more and funnier. That's obviously a change that I think he made from the script.
Yeah, clearly.
Which is much more sort of telling about his attitudes towards the media, I think, and what part they play. I mean, there's also the other big difference, I guess, would be there's this entire kind of car chase scene towards the end. And where there's a bit where the police go on strike, if you've seen the movie.
Oh, right.
RoboCop is supposed to go in and try and disperse the crowd. And then there's a huge car chase scene before you end up at the steel mill at the end.
Right.
And that is kind of, I'm guessing that was probably too expensive, which is why they cut it. Because you've got to do a car, you've got to have all the extras and you've got to have him transition. But also it doesn't play too well because you've got like RoboCop attacking normal people. Probably not in keeping with the kind of heroic.
And it really doesn't much to advance the story, even, like, you know, because like you know, it's like, you know, that eventually still get to, you know, the final fight and stuff like that, which actually then, you know, I feel like the way that played out without the scene you mentioned and everything, it kind of really emphasizes how, you know, like the other part about all this is that, you know, even though that we have this corporate, you know, and sci-fi and all that, but this very much has a feeling of a Western, you know, and and just even how, you know, even RoboCop himself, right? He does the gun twirling stuff, you know, like, and it said that like, oh, you know, he does it because like his son loves his, you know, fictional character, which is a funny show within the show, like that like there's this character who you know, very much like kind of almost reflects the character that like he ends up being and stuff like that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. TJ Laser. is almost is actually like the simplified version. And ironically, what kind of Robocop became. By Robocop 3, he is basically TJ later.
Right.
But I mean, this is like such a great satire of Westerns and just our view of like the single lone gunman who's completely bulletproof. It's like Paul Verhoeven saying, okay, you want a hero that can't get shot? Well, here he is. He's not human, and he has no genitals. He's had to sacrifice a lot to be the ultimate sort of hyper male fantasy. And I mean, it is a kind of, this is the other thing I want to point about Paul Verhoeven is that he really does sort of play with the common fantasy kind of themes. Like you see that in Total Recall is really about sort of fantasy. And I mean, I guess Starship Troopers, I think, is almost like kind of a video game sort of fantasy made into a movie, or more or less. I guess same with Basic Instinct. It's about sort of, I guess, having an affair and how that can go wrong. And I mean, this one is definitely kind of like a power fantasy, and obviously very effective because that's all that people mostly took out of it. Hence why there was a toy line made shortly after, and why school kids were running around the schoolyard going, "Hey, you seen RoboCop?" So, which is very much the case when I was growing up.
Just like what you're saying about the toys too, it's funny how like one of the commercials is this like kind of this game that like is played with a family that is about thermonuclear warfare stuff. And so it's funny, we've only talked about it a few times but sometimes we really forget about how in the 80s, like very much in the forefront of people's minds is at any second we are on the brink of like nuclear, like annihilation and stuff. And it's something that like nowadays you hardly ever hear about it, like kind of that, like, it's just something that like, like even though like a lot of them, like have been decommissioned, all that kind of stuff, but there's still a lot of nukes out there, and like kind of, so it's still very real possibility that we can, because back then we can nuke the world many times over. Now we can only like, nuke ourselves a few times over, but it's still like kind of total annihilation we're talking about.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, now it's more sort of framed in terms of a localized kind of terrorist threat in one city or something like that. That always seems to be the thing. I mean, that's the other point we should say about like OCP is that the whole thing that the sort of danger that he's sort of putting forward in this is that Ed 209, is about to be sold to the military. And this idea of like, drone militarization. Yeah. Oh, we've got that now, so that's one thing that was way ahead of its time. And I mean, also you look at like when Dick Jones is talking about all the different markets that have been not something that a corporation would normally explore, and you've got sort of incarceration, police forces, care, and I'm just like, oh bloody hell, like where how far are we away from
Well, I mean, that's the thing. We're not, like kind of one of those kind of stories that we haven't really talked much about, but it's very much a reality in the States is how, the prison system is like this kind of institution that like, it seems on the surface to be like, oh, well, it's just part of the legal system, all that kind of stuff. But it's big business because like, we're talking about millions of people that are incarcerated, on annual basis. So, I mean, it's I don't know the actual numbers and stuff, but I just know that like we're talking about like a significant part of our GDP or whatever, something like that. It's spent on basically keeping people in prison, and of course just all those infrastructures that's needed to support that and stuff.
And of course, it makes you wonder, like, would RoboCop actually be good for business for OCP? Because he seems to kill so many people that he's kind of. And we can get into the parallels with Judge Dredd, but he's kind of very highly influenced. I think even Paul Verhoeven said that Judge Dredd was a major influence. And he's like, judge, jury, and executioner for every sort of criminal he comes across. So I guess the prison wing of OCP would start to lose money if RoboCop, or they did a series of RoboCops,
that's a really interesting point. Like, like they made at some point way like, what's called the cost profit ROI of like having RoboCop in action versus kind of incarcerating the prisoners and stuff for the felons.
but then the medical wing of OCP would do well because they'd have to build more cops into Robocop, and they'd have to sort of treat all the bullet wounds that he'd inflicted on people. So
Right.
I'm sure it'll balance out somewhere. You know,
Right.
these guys didn't get to the top for no reason. You know, they'll figure it out.
And that's a great point too about how like you know, like a lot of the business in at certain points and stuff, and you know, probably to some degree it's still done that way. That like, you know, I heard of a court case years ago that apparently the car company basically did a cost benefit analysis, like, you know, how many people were going to be killed and like what the reparations were versus, you know, how much it would cost to replace the partner thing. And so this is an actual case that like they ultimately decided that like, oh, it was okay to like kind of, you know, choose to like have, you know, like kind of the lives of the people suing the company because the cost of replacing the part would be, you know, more dollars and stuff. So of course, you know, like kind of what that ended up happening though was that once, you know, somehow the people found out, you know, the internal documents or whatever, stuff like that, they basically sued for, you know, X times over that, and the courts awarded it just basically, you know, like kind of as damages to kind of basically set an example that like, no, that's not how you like, you know, evaluate, you know, like kind of, you know, the cost of doing something and stuff.
Yeah, but I mean, and that's done in large sort of insurance policies as well for hospitals and things like this. They always sort of like have to measure out exactly the risk and what they're going to be sort of liable for in terms of botched operations and things like this. That can get pretty grisly, which is as you can imagine. But yeah, so the other thing I was going to say about this is that it kind of, the one thing that obviously struck me when I was watching it is the connection between Terminator and Terminator 2.
Right.
Because when you look at a lot of the stuff, Terminator and Robocop are pretty similar movies, and I think I could be wrong, but it could have been a very similar production company. And, you know, big kind of robotic, unfeeling thing going around, mowing people down. Only this time it's kind of like helping people.
Right.
But then you look at Terminator 2, and even some of the scenes are the same. I was thinking about Robocop walking out of flames, and that's very similar to Terminator 2, where they're walking out of flames. And likewise, you know, I think Robocop 2, which came out before Terminator 2, has him riding a Harley. And it's just, you know, oh yeah, this is really sort of hitting a very few sort of similar notes.
Oh, definitely. Like Orion, you know, released, of course, Terminator, and then once they saw the, you know, the bucks, you know, once they saw the dollar signs on that, they were more motivated to kind of make Robocop, because Robocop, the script was bouncing around for like, you know, ages until you know, like kind of that happened and stuff with the success of Terminator, and then also like kind of, you know, getting somebody, you know, like Paul Verhoeven willing to actually pick up the script and stuff like that. So it was like kind of just this kind of chain of events. And then, you know, definitely, you know, I think somebody else also pointed out to that, you know, kind of the connections of like kind of like you said, the, you know, Robocop walking out of a fire and you know, those kind of similar kind of.
Yeah, I mean, both Terminator 1 and 2 and Robocop all end up in a steel mill as well. The finale,
right.
You know, which is this kind of thing of like, we're going back to a place where machines are made, or the you know, the fundamentals for a machine is made, and that's where we're kind of having our face off, which is kind of an interesting sort of thing of, you know, man meeting machine, I suppose. But yeah, it's. And also the other movie that really it strangely reminds me of, just purely on a visual basis, is Eraserhead, because that is all set in kind of in like lots of sort of steel factory parts of Detroit as well, which is kind of an odd thing. I just can't think of many other movies. There probably are them, but you know, that aren't set in factories around Detroit. Yeah,
I think one thing, you know, like you kind of mentioned about Maggie May and you know, kind of her idea about you know, reflecting kind of gender and stuff like that. One thing I kind of started, you know, looking into, you know, is this idea that like sci-fi really has a way of like kind of talking to kind of the gender issue and stuff. You know, not just simply transgender, but also like male, female. You know, because certainly over the years, seeing somebody like Uhura in a non-traditional role and stuff like that kind of really reflected that, like, you know, roles can change. And here we have Nancy Allen as the partner, who she's really very much shown as an equal and stuff. So there's like, regardless of the transgender, you know, interpretation, I feel like that's really one thing it really shows that, like, and I'm trying to think now of many, you know, like, certainly we had Little Hamilton, like I said, just with Terminator showing a strong female and stuff. But I feel like that was like a trend probably right around the 80s that we started seeing that more. Like Ripley was another one, of course, in Alien. Yeah. And so it's no, you know, no doubt that like these kind of all influenced each other, and also just kind of, I think, created this wave of like kind of like, well, actually, you know, we can have, you know, like kind of, you know, females, and, you know, where they're not like kind of just shrieking and, you know, like kind of, you know, running away and stuff.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, she's very much a kind of a foil for Murphy at the beginning. They're kind of, you know, you get the feeling they're sort of, you know, just bouncing off each other, and she's a very kind of compelling character, really. And I think, yeah, sort of in Maggie May Fish's video, she said, oh, wouldn't it be cool if there was, you know, because she was close to being mortally injured at the end, wouldn't it have been cool if there was a Robocop sequel where there were two Robocops, one of which being Lewis, which I thought was, yeah, that's actually a really fun idea.
I do feel like that was a lost opportunity, because like it would have been like something else to see, like, you know, Pear and stuff. So
yeah, it's funny though. I mean, it's a very sort of simplistic kind of view of women though in sci-fi and stuff like this in the 80s. And I, by pure coincidence, watched the Transformers movie from 1986. And there's one solitary sort of female transformer in there,
right.
And it does make you wonder, like, why is that? Where there just be one? But I mean, you know, it's just a very kind of, you know, she just acts quite stereotypically in a way, which is kind of strange. But yeah, she does some fighting and stuff. It's something.
I'm thinking that part of it is that, like, that they're speaking to kind of quote unquote the market, right? Where you have like, you know, young boys, right? Like kind of, you know, for the most part. So they're selling toys, you know, because ultimately Transformers are these toys that, you know, kind of, you know, the kids really crave for the holidays and all that kind of stuff. So probably only so many, you know, girls in theory kind of would only be interested. But what's funny though is that if they made it where, you know, the female character was interesting and stuff, would that have you know, attracted more girls then to the Transformers series and stuff? Who knows? I mean, so I think it's like kind of this, you know, which we run into with overall a lot of these institutions in Hollywood and, you know, in general, we're like, on one hand, we're saying like, okay, the reality is that most of the demographics of, you know, kids that would be interested in toys with boys, but on the other, it's like if you had stories with compelling, you know, female characters, would there be, you know, in the Transformers series, would that have created more of a market for, you know, you know, girls being interested in stuff?
Yeah, it would have been interesting if they had a female Robocop as well. I think that'd be really been. I mean, it does make you wonder though why. Yeah, I mean, obviously it probably made money, but it just seems like a kind of a weird transition to make a line of toys out of Robocop. It's you know, I mean, Robocop is not only kind of uncomfortable. I mean, it's pretty grotesque at times in terms of, you know, in terms of movie going experience. I mean, the whole scene where Murphy's just been, I mean, when Murphy's getting shot and afterwards, I mean, that's a fairly sort of brutal hospital scene where they're trying to kind of bring him back. It's a very, that goes back to the Verhoeven sort of thing of like, you know, really showing you all the nuts and bolts of everything that happens. You know, it's a very kind of brutal scene in that respect. Yeah, so it's, I don't know. That is the 80s. What can I say?
Well,
different times.
Speaking more of the 80s, I think another kind of interesting kind of connection or parallel is like, you know, something like American Psycho, where we really see like kind of, you know, these yuppies and like kind of, you know, and they're like, you know, you were seeing some signs of how, like, besides the traditional corporate sports talk, they're talking like in military terms and like kind of how, you know, back then, like the cool thing to do was like kind of to read, you know, Japanese war philosophy and stuff like that. And we really see that kind of in some of the dialogue with these characters.
Yeah, no, I think that was exactly the same movie that occurred to me at the same time, because in some respects you've got, you know, it's kind of like a male power fantasy, but this time more kind of financial and lifestyle based. He's kind of completely unempathetic, you know, unfeeling kind of protagonist. who's also kind of ultra violent and does, but the difference is, I mean, and well, I say another similarity is that he is also following a plan that's laid out for him. He's following the corporate lifestyle plan. And he's basically, as we say, that, you know, corporations are psychopathic. He is actually just being totally obedient to that sort of frame of mind. And likewise, Robocop is being a psychopath on behalf of the corporation. Yeah, so it's they're both kind of following the same thing. And I think in a way, you know, and I've started realizing this, is when you start to see people, particularly in sci-fi, that are part machine or get turned into machines, that's a sign that they are being controlled by someone else, or there is a part of them that is obeying some larger authority. Like the reason Darth Vader is mostly machine is because he is the instrument of an authoritarian regime. And, you know, I see the same thing with Robocop. He's like, and he's in his whole struggle is finding his humanity out of this sort of robotic nature.
Yeah, and that's something we'll kind of, you know, kind of talk more about going into the remake and stuff like that, is how something that, you know, is kind of essential to this story and this version is that he actually doesn't know who he is for a good part of after he's killed off, and as he, you know, kind of like you said, where he's reborn as his baby and stuff like that, he's like trying to figure out who in fact there's not even really that question until a certain point where it's actually his partner, you know, Nancy Allen plays and stuff, Lewis, who actually approaches him and say, you know, Murphy, is that you? Like kind of, you know, like she's the one that recognizes the little kind of, you know, signs, that like the gun twirling, stuff like that, that like, you know, wait a minute, like kind of, you know, she's the one who connects the dots. And if she actually didn't exist in the story, or like, you know, was killed even earlier, then who knows whether he would actually even figure out that he's actually, you know, the resurrected Murphy and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, it's like a sort of a detective story, light in a way. So there's sort of elements of kind of film noir almost, you could say, perhaps, in Robocop. Yeah, but you're right. So it's like a sort of a partner crime-solving thing. Not that it's like takes a lot of figuring out, but
it's not a mystery
done at the end of the day. But yeah.
No, it's not a mystery to us as the audience. But it's just interesting how, from his perspective, though, and that's another interesting thing too. That like, certainly it's used in the Terminator, but it's interesting how different times we see like his point of view and also his memories as after Murphy, you know, tells him this, he starts kind of having these memories, and we're seeing from, you know, Robo's perspective of the life of, you know, Alex Murphy and how, you know, like kind of his life before and stuff, and that's it's interesting how we don't see that until, you know, like when he's trying to remember stuff.
Yeah, another scene I think is really interesting actually is the scene where he's having the dreams, because this is the first indication that there's sort of a human that they can't control behind them.
Right.
Our subconscious. But in the way it's portrayed is of a graph going like, you know, with lots of high and low peaks, lots of activity.
Right.
And then when he wakes up, it's like flatline, which is this kind of thing of like normality is, you know, not the natural human state, so to speak. But also I kind of think that there's a sort of a statement a little bit on society. It's like, you know, there's a lot going on under the cover, and normality is like a very narrow band of our sort of graft existence, so to speak.
Right. Yeah, that definitely gets into like kind of the things we talk about in Westworld, where like, you know, our when we stay in our lane, so to speak, we're very much just following these kind of loops, you know, like kind of. So that's totally, interesting. Yeah. I didn't really kind of make that, you know, connection until you said that and stuff.
Yeah, it's governance by graph and and people being mapped by graphs. It's just something because I've been learning about cloud computing, and that's how they do the databases and social media. So it's kind of a weird way of thinking about the world, but yeah.
And the music reflects things, you know, along that lines too, because anytime we hear the big dramatic music, it's classical and stuff like that, we're kind of showing like kind of, you know, this humanity and kind of heroism and stuff like that. And other times, you know, it's kind of like this more electronic kind of, you know, synthesized stuff that kind of shows like kind of, you know, we're just following things along and stuff.
Well, the funny thing is, I don't think there's a lot of synthesizer music in Robocop.
Well,
it's mostly orchestral, actually. You know, I mean, his main theme is kind of catchy, and again, it's like another classic 80s character theme. But if you took out the clanging and the other bits, it sounds like a Western theme, going back to exactly what you're saying. You know, it's only this kind of extra clanging, you know, from, say, the Terminator, that's added in that makes it less like a Western theme. But that also, I mean, yeah, we kind of touched on this earlier, but I do think that Paul Verhoeven's message in this is satirizing, you know, the Westerns, these heroes. And I think that soundtrack is exactly an indication of that. It's kind of doing a twist on that.
Coincidentally, the Basil Poledouris, who does the soundtrack, actually did the soundtrack for Red Dawn. So that's another funny kind of connection, because we talked about in Red Dawn how like there was very much this kind of Western kind of feel to things, and it's probably less of a that they're kind of, I don't know, maybe in some ways they're glorifying the Western, but I feel like it's almost like a and not quite a satire, but I'm trying to think of the term, but it's like kind of where they're emulating, I guess, that Western feel and everything like that. So maybe just in some ways that like it's just, you know, along the lines of like amping it up to kind of you know, basically drum up the feelings we have right when the cowboy is riding into the sunset or something like that.
Which he is literally doing. He's like riding in his car and the sun's going down and it's, you know, it's and of course he spins the gun and everything. Yeah, totally. But it's a great soundtrack. One of my favorites. One of my favorite parts of that soundtrack is actually when he visits his old home, and that for me is the scene that is like really the most surreal for me. It's the one that kind of sticks with me. That it's strange because, you know, it's been 3 months since his wife and kid find out that he's dead, but there's all this kind of, the fact that he can just walk straight into this house is weird.
Right.
It's like this in the future. There's obviously no kind of real estate agents anymore, just computer desks.
Right.
You can walk in, but there's all this kind of like trash and stuff like lying around, and you know, you've just got this computer telling you the growth rate. But there's also just these, I mean, obviously it's very convenient for the plot that there's mementos of the old family lying there. But you get this impression that like they kind of just dropped everything and just bolted. You know, it's a really kind of weird situation. And that, you know, with these other flashbacks, you know, whether he's going through a female identity or not, you know, depending on how you want to interpret that scene. But it's a really strange scene in general, and the music is very effective. It's very different from the kind of hard edge music in the rest of the movie.
Right.
Yeah, it's one that really sticks with me.
I feel like what, you know, like kind of that walking through the house is like, you know, really him. You know, the obvious one, of course, is that he's like kind of, you know, remembering who he is and stuff like that. But I feel like in a way, it's almost like a statement about how when you make a transition right into, you know, so regardless of the transgender interpretation stuff, but I feel like anytime that you're, you know, kind of changed or transformed, part of that is that, like, you know, we do look back with, you know, nostalgia, with like longing for like how things were, and I feel like that's really captured, you know, like kind of that, like it's a very kind of like soft spot, if you will, of like kind of that, like, you know, here's this kind of you know, Teflon shell being and stuff like that. He's you know, impervious from the outside, but then, like, you know, still somehow underneath is like that humanity, and also like, you know, here we are, like that he can't really escape that like so on the one hand he's starting to kind of, you know, move, and like, you know, he's no longer the baby that kind of doesn't really know what's going on, and kind of like, you know, basically, you know, giving orders and stuff. But along with this transformation is, you know, as you kind of talk about how he's kind of facing up to the corporate adult and stuff, is the fact that like he's still like kind of is holding on to what was before. So while he's getting this freedom, in other words, he's also still a little bit like kind of holding on to what was always, you know, or what was and stuff.
Yeah, and you wonder if it's actually a real thing that he's holding on to in a way,
right? Yeah,
because it's so kind of cheesy. He's going, "Dad, can you do that?" And she's like, "I've got something to tell you. I love you." And it's all kind of, it's almost a bit, considering how grimy and realistic, these things almost seem sort of surreally kind of apple pie. And then there's the weird scene of them waving to him as he leaves, and it's kind of, it's almost like a David Lynch movie.
It's almost dreamlike.
Yeah, totally.
Even though he's awake and stuff too. Like so on the one, like he was dreaming, right? Like where he has a memory, and then another time he's awake and having this kind of dreamlike, memory. And it's funny how as Maggie May pointed out, it's different. Like on the one version, she's like ready again to fight, and another one, it's kind of very much like a more sweet and kind of so that one's like kind of, what's funny is that one's where he's awake, I guess, too. So
it reminds me of the line later on in the movie where he says, when he's asking, after he's taken his helmet off and he's talking to Lewis, and he says, Murphy must have had a wife and a daughter, which is firstly the interesting thing is that he doesn't identify himself as Murphy anymore. Yeah. He is accepted actually at that point that he is some sort of something else. Oh no, that's it. I feel them, but I can't remember them. Which is kind of what you get from that sequence when he's walking through the house, is that he doesn't actually remember accurately what his family is like, but he has this sort of idealized suggestion of something that was there, but he can't quite place it, which is really effectively done in that scene, I think.
Yeah, you gotta wonder how, like from a technology perspective, right, where it seems like that different times he's kind of almost without feeling, like kind of because everything's mechanical, right? So there's no like sensors for him to feel things, and yet like there's this kind of idea of like phantom limbs and stuff like that, right? And so you have to wonder how like the like from a semi geeky practical perspective, how does he reconcile like different times, something like you said, of where he's feeling something or wanting to feel something, but yet like, he can't, right? Like other than maybe like possibly touching his face or something like that, there's really nothing for him to feel too.
Yeah, not with his hands anyway, that's for sure. I mean, it also indicates that like Paul Verhoeven clearly thinks that our identity isn't necessarily tied to our conscious memories in a way, because he's saying, I know there's something else there. I can feel it, but I can't process it, or I'm not aware of it. Which is kind of an interesting take on it.
Definitely.
Almost as if there's the human soul is interacting with the technology. I mean, the other thing I was going to say about this is that the one thing I never really thought of, but it's only because we've watched so many revenge movies, that this really is it's yet another revenge movie,
Right.
And it's very, and I would say this is probably a good, because we need to start talking about the 2014 one. It's a real key difference between this and the 2014 is that you have the killers personally in his face shooting him, and when he dies, he sees their faces in front of him, and even in the script is a bit cheesily written because it says he sees his face and then he sees his face, then he sees, and it's almost like he's imprinting the memory of the killers on his mind. But I mean, there's a very kind of personal connection with each of the killers, and then he goes on a mission to go and get each individual one of them, which is this kind of very sort of satisfying revenge catharsism during the movie, but totally absent from the 2014 version. One of my main criticisms against it.
Well, I guess what's it called? I always feel like there's still like a few things we can talk about with the original stuff.
Totally, yeah.
And but yeah, I agree that like we probably need to kind of almost at this point dive into the remake and stuff. One thing I do have to kind of mention though is, or a couple of things with the couple actors worth mentioning is, Ronny Cox plays Dick Jones, who's like kind of, kind of the big adversary, and we'll see him again in Total Recall and stuff. So that'll be fun to kind of revisit with him. Kurtwood Smith, before the '70s show, like kind of for him to play this kind of, Clarence Boddicker, he's like the kind of black hat in this movie like, it's like, and it's funny because like, in some ways, I feel like like the character he plays in the '70s show as a father or something like that, it's kind of like what would Clarence Boddicker be like if he was a dad and stuff.
Totally, yeah. I'm glad we actually managed to fit in Clarence Boddicker before we move on, because I mean, you know, they say a movie's only as good as your bad guy, and they
Yeah.
don't really get any better than Clarence Boddicker.
Absolutely.
I mean, from classic lines like "bitches leave" and "ni ni 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 ni," you know, I mean, it's just he's
Right,
just
right.
such an amazing bad guy. And what I like about him is that they changed him from the script, and that he was really quite a kind of, he was taking a lot of drugs and things like this in the script, and they made him, you know, smart enough that he doesn't get high off his own supply, and this he's kind of, you know, very calculating and completely psychopathic, but also, you know, smart enough to understand the interrelationships of who he's working for and stuff like this. But man,
definitely.
What an awesome bad guy.
and a kind of minor side note is the secretary at one point that he hits on and stuff like that. He actually ends up meeting her, marrying her and stuff like that. So that's another in real life and stuff. So that's funny kind of you know, connection. So he's actually, I think part of the intelligence that comes across is he's apparently, you know, there's nothing to what's it called, you know, Kurtwood Smith's actual intelligence and stuff.
Totally, yeah. Yeah, he's one of my all-time favorite bad guys, Clarence Boddicker, no doubt about it.
Alrighty, so I think actually, you know, like kind of talk about the remake and stuff like that. So here it's funny that we lead off with Samuel Jackson as the media presence and everything, and then just kind of connecting back to the original, we have like kind of very much a almost like typical where you have like the you know, the two newscasters kind of, you know, bouncing off of each other, stuff like that. And, you know, like what actually both of them were actual media figures in the original, because you have Mario Machado, who's playing Casey Wong and stuff like that. And he's actual, and that's the thing, as he doesn't really look Asian, but apparently he actually is and stuff. He was actually the first Chinese, you know, American newscaster in the U.S., you know, apparently. And then you have Lisa Gibbons, who she's really well known as a, you know, and at that point, I think she's just a very more kind of local reporter, but she ends up being a somebody who kind of is a celebrity / entertainment reporter, something like that, who, you know, throughout the 80s, he becomes more.
Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
So yeah, in the 2014 remake, we once again have Samuel Jackson as the introduction to this world, you know, showing the media. And it's funny how that in itself is a reflection, because we have more media celebrities, and we kind of had them in the 80s, but not to the extent that nowadays, right? We have like, you know, maybe like the Joe Rogan show or the Larry King show and stuff like that. And I feel like, you know, here we have Samuel Jackson as Pat Novak, right? And what was it called again? It was like the Novak.
The Novak report or something like that.
Yeah. And basically, like it's a weird kind of thing where also that another thing that's reflected is how I mean, certainly we know that the media at different times has biases and stuff, but here I think it's a reflection of how like modern media can have a very strong bias towards different things, because here he's basically arguing for, you know, like kind of why can't we have, you know, more drones and at home and stuff, and that and this movie really centers around this Dreyfus Act that is the kind of almost like the villain, if you will, in the sense of that, like where that's keeping us from having, you know, better protection with drones and stuff like that, and other than that, the only other kind of villain I'd say is this actual trainer that I guess that's involved. He's actually played by Jackie Earle Haley, who will, you know, as Maddox, and who we'll actually talk about in future episodes with Bad News Bears, and then who's also Rorschach with the original Watchmen movie and stuff.
Yeah, he was kind of an interesting character to introduce. But yeah, I mean, there's a foregone conclusion in this one that the media is bought and sold by the corporation, basically, and is making their case.
Yes.
So, and that's actually probably the most dated thing about the original, is the way the news is presented is very different. And, you know, we're into this sort of era now of, it's almost like, you know, we've taken a YouTuber and we stick them on a cable channel and we just have this one sort of person that we're listening to, and they interview a few people that argue about themselves. But, you know, that's the way the news has changed. I think for me, the real missed opportunity here for the Paul Pat Novak thing. I mean, for me, and I don't know if you can really call it a criticism. Maybe they were just going for something different. But I really missed the satire of the original. Yeah. You know, I really missed the humor. It just seemed very absent. And I mean, you can say, okay, maybe they were trying to do something different. They didn't. They sure. thought, well, that's such a sort of a hallmark of the original. We won't try and repeat that, which is, I guess, a sort of fair enough thing. But I think, considering that he's portrayed as such an obvious kind of tool of the corporation, and he's supposed to be there as, you know, the in-your-face corporate power that we're trying to be sold on, they could have done more to kind of, you know, injected some more humor and satire into his character. And there's this kind of half-hearted effort right at the end of the movie with him, where it's just Samuel L. Jackson swearing a lot. Oh, surprise, surprise, because he's frustrated because it didn't work out. And it's kind of vaguely amusing, but, you know, as any good stand-up comedian will tell you, if you've got to rely on, you know, F-bombs, etc., to make your jokes, then it's not a very good joke to begin with, really. So, yeah, that was a kind of a disappointing thing for me. I just didn't feel there was enough humor in there, and I didn't think they really made the most of that. I think there's a lot of other things that you can point out that are quite ridiculous. I mean, Rachel Maddow's ability to kind of talk around a subject and takes her like 20 minutes to get to like the point of what she's actually talking about is, I mean, not that you have 20 minutes in a movie, but, you know, there's lots of other things you could pick up on to make fun of these kind of characters.
Yeah, I think overall, the only thing that they really kept from the original was the you know, the 4 directives and stuff. I mean, other than that, you know, like kind of, it's a really like, you know, I mean, I guess that's a challenge that we come across these remakes all the time, is that like, what do you keep from the original and what do you kind of, you know, like figure that like, oh, you know, like kind of, we don't need to kind of go back there and stuff like that. And certainly, like, you know, part of the heart of, you know, like kind of the Robocop story is this, you know, kind of the 4 directives and stuff. You know, like certainly, you know, it's very prevalent in the original, because that's, of course, as we kind of talked about, is like kind of the climax, right, where basically, you know, kind of the old man says, you know, Dick, you're fired, you know, kind of, and you know, kind of where he gets to blow him away, and that's kind of like the safety's off and stuff like that. And here, you know, like kind of, we have, you know, that to a degree, but it's definitely not, you know, I guess what's also a challenge is that, like, we know that's coming, like that's like no surprise, I guess, and stuff like that. Like here in the original, that was actually like kind of, you know, it was almost like a little bit of a funny ending as well, because in the end, you know, like kind of all said and done, like once the old man, like kind of, you know, like basically you know, realizes this as well, that's like kind of, you know, what allows Robocop to be, you know, not only the redeemer, I guess, in this case, but also like kind of to get his revenge and stuff like that. So it's everything kind of all at once, down to that one statement and stuff.
Yeah, and I think actually you mentioned it when some of the stuff in the notes, that these are almost like a kind of a twisted, warped version of the 3 laws of robotics from Isaac Asimov.
Right.
You know, it's an interesting sort of adaptation put into a kind of a law enforcing frame, which I thought was a really interesting sort of take on it. But yeah, that is the only thing they kept, really. I mean, like you said, it's one thing that got me is it's just a slow movie. It's like an hour before he's even out there fighting crime. You know, it takes a very long time for him to get there. And they have there's one of the other, I guess I'm being harsh. What I would say with the 2014 Robocop is there's actually some interesting themes in it, but I just don't know that they all come together to make a very entertaining movie. I mean, they take the complete reverse approach to the humanity of Robocop, in that when he's first made into Robocop, he starts off quite human. He's fully actually aware of who he is.
Right.
And they do this process of whittling him down, whittling away his humanity.
Right.
which is kind of an interesting take on it, actually. And actually, in some respects, it's very effective in making you feel more sorry for the character. I mean, there's a lot of stuff where you really feel, I mean, it's quite more tragic, I would say, than the original. Because first of all, you know, from this bomb blast that there's actually quite a lot of him remaining. And then when they finally reveal him, there's just like a head and a pair of lungs. And it's quite a shocking moment when they reveal what's actually left of him. And that's one of those ones that's really like, wow, this, you know, you're going to sign away your life to a corporation. They'll, you know, they're going to take a mile when you say it's going to be an inch, you know. It's that was pretty disturbing, that whole scene, to be honest with you.
I would say it was more horror. Like, you know, that's one of the things we've talked about before.
You're right.
You know, like, you know, to see that, like, I would say that, like, contrasting the two, like the original Murphy, you know, with Peter Weller and stuff like that. And here we have Joel Kinneman, actually, that he's actually somebody who, you know, like, there's something about him that, like, you know, he's from the series of Killing, and also we'll see him in Hanna and stuff like that. And he does play like this tragic hero, very much like kind of, you know, and so really what's comes across is like kind of just the shock of seeing, like, kind of like you said, what's left of him and stuff.
Yeah, and it's quite effective in a way, because I think you're kind of spared from that emotional turmoil in the original, because he's not very human to begin with. He's more machine, and so you know, that kind of realization only really comes towards the end of the movie. In the original, with this one, it's like you get that full shock of going, Jesus, there's nothing left of me, you know. And you know, the fact that they also introduce you to the family, and you really see that home life, and there's no kind of, you know, mystery about what his home life was it an idealized version or whatever, you know. You see he's got a loving wife and son, and they're desperate to have him back, and, you know, he's just like, well, there's nothing of me left at all. I mean, it's it's pretty horrendous. So in that respect, of making him a sort of a tragic hero, making you feel sorry for him, is very effective in that respect.
And it's an interesting choice, though, that they played that up, right? Because, you know, in the original, like, you know, like you said, we really, Murphy doesn't really remember much of his life for most of the movie. And even then, we only get bare glimpses of that life and stuff. Whereas in this one, we see, like, kind of, you know, Murphy as a very human character and stuff like that. And he's stripped down as time goes on. And then, you know, like, part of the whole thing, too, is here we have, you know, Gary Oldman, who's you know, somebody we haven't talked about, but he's very much like this chameleon actor. And here he's playing the scientist who, on the one hand, he's very much like, you know, for the humanity, he's really trying to defend it. But as time goes on, he's the one who's like actually he's the actual person pulling the lever and kind of whittling down the humanity and stuff. And he does it to great effect. I mean, he really, like, I feel like different times what we're really seeing is how, like, somebody who, like, in principle is very decent will over time, like, kind of just, you know, make different compromises, because, you know, like, at a certain point, you know, like the seduction, right, with Michael Keaton as the, you know, big corporate head this time, in a very kind of Steve Jobs kind of figure and stuff. He's like saying, like, hey, we'll give you back more funding, like, kind of, you know, so he's like very much the devil and stuff like that, you know, whispering in, you know, Dr. Norton's ear, stuff like that. And we see, like, kind of the seduction happening, and, like, that over time, you know, as, you know, Murphy's kind of being less and less human, it's also the humanity of this doctor as well that's kind of being whittled down over time.
Yeah, you're right. It is. There's very much a sort of parallel there. I think the other interesting difference is, and this shows you sort of our approach to this intelligent scientist kind of character in movies, which I guess I always think of, like, Jeff Goldblum in Jurassic Park as like one of the earlier kind of examples. Is this person that you're actually supposed to kind of empathize with or identify with, because they're the most intelligent person in the movie, right? So clearly you're an intelligent viewer and you're going to identify with them. But, you know, it's become, rather than a team of scientists like it is in the original, it's now one kind of super genius individual, you know. We've gone for this kind of thing, and this kind of represents a lot of the tech market. We always sort of see like it's Elon Musk who's the entire guy, who's the genius behind, Falcon X and everything, when it's really just like hundreds and hundreds of really talented scientists and things like this. So there's very much this kind of hero intellectual, which we've seen in the last 20 or so years. But you're right. I mean, in some respects, he's pretty evil, really. I mean, what he does is he kind of, I liked his bargaining chip at the end where he said, okay, I need 10 years of funded, research, but that's just like kind of a ploy to go and free him. But he was pretty effective, Gary Oldman. But I mean, probably the most interesting twist, I would say, in this is this idea that they've actually taken away all agency from Murphy, and it's just the algorithm running his actions, and he just thinks it's him doing it, which I thought was a really interesting twist on this idea of like human robot kind of efficiency, because that's the real main issue. And that it's a bigger sort of argument as well. It's like humans versus robots, which ones, when humans can't outperform them for certain tasks, well, then we get replaced, right?
Yeah.
Which is kind of a current theme. But also this idea that the training and the algorithm is the one that's doing the killing, and it's the human that's left behind. Yeah. It sort of makes me think. I think to some respects this is somewhat a statement on combat training in general for armed forces. It's this idea you condition people to the point where, and you're obviously more of a sort of authority on this, but the idea that you take out the human thing of, is this right, is this wrong, and you get people to sort of act and not think too much. But I don't know, I will pass that to you on that sort of point.
Well, just what you said though, like pointed out that one sequence where he's, like you said, going through a training exercise to demonstrate his skills, and it was like you said, when they deactivated his human reasoning and stuff, that and there's actually, I guess, Gary Oldman who actually ultimately decides that that's how to go about it. That like when he because what he says is that like it's his human decision making where he's like judging, like right versus wrong and stuff like that. That was in the way, and so it's the similarity is that like there's been discussions that like for example, like in the military jets, right, that they can build planes now that stress beyond, what a human being can tolerate in terms of G-forces and stuff. And so that's the limiting factor, is the human inside the cockpit and stuff for manned aircraft. Now, what's happening though is that like we've shifted towards more unmanned aircraft. In fact, only a few years ago, we had the first, combat, unmanned aircraft land on an aircraft carrier. So I think what was kind of driving us towards that was the first thing that kind of happened was that in the FA-18, which was a manned aircraft and stuff like that, was one of the last, main airframes before the more recent ones, maybe like the only other one being the F-35, they had built into it a automatic aircraft landing system, because the hardest thing actually for these carrier pilots is not the air-to-air combat. It's actually landing on a carrier at night in the middle of a storm and stuff like that. Right, and so once they designed a system that could do that automatically and stuff, it really like, removed one of the key limiting factors and everything. And so that in itself then made it where, okay, humans were still needed for like air-to-air combat, but of course, once you like design this system, then they can kind of look at more like, well, can we actually design unmanned, aircraft that can go into combat and go beyond the stresses that a human being can tolerate and stuff like that? Because now we can land it on the aircraft carrier as well, right, and stuff, because we can take that same system and put it into unmanned aircraft. And so that's in fact what they've recently done and stuff. So I mean, it's maybe sometimes that thing where technology over time, we really are moving towards removing the human element and stuff. But of course, as we get into movies like this, it raises the question then, okay, what are we really giving up?
Yes. And I think it's worth noting that human beings, while they can be highly suggestible, they can't actually be hacked to go and sort of kill people directly, like a sort of a killer sort of drone might be able to. but yeah, I think that's obviously, you know, drone warfare is a big theme with this movie.
Absolutely.
It starts off with a rather kind of stereotypical view of the Middle East and people trying to sort of like suicide bomb them. Right? And I mean, to be honest, the whole thing reminded me of Metal Gear Solid 4, to be honest with you. It just, I thought it was, and of course it's CGI, so I kind of expected, you know, Snake to be walking across or something like this, but creeping across the landscape. But yeah, no, I mean, it was that. And I mean, I suppose there is a little bit of the kind of the cynicism about the media in the, you know, you've got Sam Jackson after the kid, you know, basically it guns down the kid, this Iranian kid in the news report, and he's just there saying to the news reporter, hey, you know, Stacy or whatever her name is, you know, you all right? Are you all right? You know, make sure that's you know, complete disregard for this people that are being, you know, freed. And and the general there saying, you know, oh, they actually like us there, you know, it's all great, you know. But it all kind of feels a bit sort of crowbarred in and a bit sort of hackneyed, really, I would say. But, you know, they're obviously trying to sort of stay current. I mean, I think funny. The other... Sorry, go on.
I was going to say that was an opportunity, though, that, like, you know, for some kind of, you know, satire or you know, kind of something. But here, you know, it was a very dry, like, trope and stuff, you know, like kind of instead, like, in other words, I feel like that was a lost opportunity there as well, like kind of that they could have done something that was, you know, like kind of maybe, you know, made more of a statement, you know, like kind of, but instead they just went with the cliche and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think I might have to just kind of rewind very slightly to the original and how the media is portrayed that, because I mean, for me, the scene where Robocop is meeting the kids and they say, any words for those kids, Robocop? Right. Stay out of trouble. And then it just cuts back to the news anchors going, we're not worried about this giant killer robot hanging around with children for a marketing exercise. You know, that is just absolute genius. And then there's other bits that are even more subtle. That's like, you know, another outbreak on the Mexican border with rebels fighting there. Now let's go to an advert. You know, it's like, that's only worth 10 seconds of news time compared to the domestic stuff. So yeah, that was...
And that really points to, at the time, you know, during the Reagan era and stuff like that, you had like messages like, you know, say no to drugs, like kind of that was the solution, right? Like kind of, and we all know how effective that was as a message and stuff. And so it's really like kind of, you know, again, that was like kind of a way to kind of point at like kind of, you know, the just like, you know, whether you call it ridiculous or whatever, that like, you know, the way that, you know, things were kind of handled at that time and stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I mean, there's that, and I mean, I think though what was interesting about this was having like the kind of the tech billionaire portrayed as someone fairly ruthless, because in a way, I mean, somewhat that's quite kind of ahead of its time in a way, because we've only really recently sort of started viewing Mark Zuckerberg and various people like that as, you know, horrendous sort of profiteers stealing our data and things like this. And that maybe wasn't the general kind of impression in 2014. So
it's hard to say,
was kind of interesting. Yeah, hard to say exactly, but I guess we were starting to sort of pick up on it. But,
I think around 2014, I'm trying to think now, like what was the headlines at that point. You know, because certainly at that point we were starting to see like kind of the Facebook and the you know, other things like that were starting to kind of emerge as like kind of the new wave of technology and stuff. You know, because we were slowly recovering. We were coming out of like kind of the recession and stuff like that was caused by the real estate crisis.
The pre-Trump,
absolutely.
And this probably coincides with the sort of the stories of like Obama giving executive sort of orders for drone strikes and things like this. That's probably like the hot subject at the time at 2014, I'm guessing. But yeah, I mean, I think in terms of more timely issues, and this may be a slightly more subtle one, is that I actually kind of think the story of Murphy in 2014 Robocop is more about PTSD than anything else, because you kind of see this traumatic event that unfolds, and the interesting difference this time is the kid actually sees it. So you're seeing this kind of traumatic event, how it impacts the family, and you know, there's even him scanning his kid's face at the scene of the thing, saying, and it's pretty blatant. It's going like emotional trauma, you know, this kind of thing. But I mean, it's and of course these sort of sequences where he's got to sort of watch all of these police cases, he's got to watch all this sort of horrendous, you know, traumatic videos of past crimes and try and get his head around it, and he starts having like a sort of a nervous breakdown.
Right.
And you know, Gary Oldman's as the scientist response is just keep drugging him until he you know, drug the trauma away until he's and they're even saying, well, he's going to be like a zombie, just like, nah, keep the drugs going. So I think that's a real kind of statement on how, you know, we deal with sort of trauma. We just try and drug it out of our systems.
That's true. Yeah. I mean, that is something that we didn't see, you know, like at all, like kind of in the original stuff like that. And
yeah, and I think there was also this interesting thing of like they had to keep him away from his family in order to keep him as an efficient sort of law enforcing thing. So there's this idea that, you know, real sort of dangerous trauma can't, you know, this society doesn't want to solve it through trying to rebuild connections and reintegrate families. It's more about isolating people. So that kind of ties in with how we deal with psychological issues. We isolate people.
And ironically, you know, my understanding of like PTSD, like kind of one of the worst things that, you know, is the feeling of isolation and stuff. So in other words, that's actually the very thing that aggravates, you know, like, I mean, you know, I have to admit, I'm not by any means, you know, have much expertise other than things I've read and things I've like kind of seen, you know, like kind of in the media to a degree and stuff like that. But, you know, like from what I understand though, that, you know, and I can certainly understand though, like, you know, you already feel different, right? Like kind of, you know, that like, you know, you have a hard time, you know, like kind of connecting with other people because you feel like nobody else understands what you've gone through and everything. So you already feel isolated in that respect. And then so if you're, you know, isolated by any, you know, kind of outside reasons and stuff, like in this case, then I can only see that, like, you know, it just only, you know, kind of like, basically it's just creating even more distance, like kind of physical distance, besides kind of what you're already experiencing emotionally and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I have a few relatives who have it, and yeah, it's not easy, you know. I mean, it definitely, and I've known people with it in the past. I used to rent a room from a guy who was like, he would wake up in the night and you know, just have nightmares, and I'd hear this like banging on the wall, and it was him like thrashing out and fighting. And I mean, that's that's pretty common with people with PTSD, from what I understand. I also think what's interesting is that one of the ways that there was a really interesting TED talk by a woman, I can't remember her name now, but she was saying one of the ways in which she got people to deal with the PTSD was to make artwork around the faces of the people that they saw killed in warfare.
Wow.
And that actually she said, is an incredibly effective tool for dealing with it. And I just started thinking about like what is left of Murphy. It's his face, you know. And I don't know if there's any kind of connection there, but it was a really sort of interesting, just sort of connection that went off in my mind when I was watching it.
Well, also in the original, right? It's interesting how, you know, we talked about this idea of revenge and stuff, and the revenge is very much driven by this idea of like remembering the face and going back and like kind of, you know, almost like the closure and stuff. Whereas in this one, he, you know, like this Murphy, you know, kind of is seen like an anonymous kind of, you know, landscape of like, you know, little pixels and stuff like that. And it's almost like in a way that, you know, like we're showing how like the traumas that it's being experienced nowadays, it's like more or less connected to, you know, kind of this one-on-one kind of thing. So even though that like we think of a revenge as kind of like being like really, you know, digging to graves idea and stuff like that, but in a way it does create some kind of closure. And then maybe, you know, like kind of nowadays, like kind of, you know, drugging and just this other, you know, ways to kind of isolate and distance ourselves is actually less healthy and stuff in some ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the other thing that, you know, we talked about earlier in that it's kind of a detective story like Robocop. In this one, they kind of expand quite a lot on that, you know. And I think what's interesting about this one is that they kind of give you this idea of, okay, you want like the best cop through, you know, giving it all this data, giving it the ability to go and do that. and he's too good at his job, because he not only kind of, unlike Robocop, who's kind of still under the original Robocop, he's still under control of the corporation. This one, he starts uncovering the layers and layers till he realizes that actually, like, you know, the head of the corporation that's the real sort of person, because he's trying to kill him at the end there. Sorry, spoiler alert, I should say. But, you know, I mean, again, in the same sort of way, in that the original made fun of like the hero trope, in that it's like, you want someone who's bulletproof, well, here you go, this is what you get. This one, it's almost like you want the perfect detective that's unfailingly moral, and, you know, well, this is what you get. He's going to find out the real problem here. Is, you know, this is going to impact you directly, the people who made him. And in a way, and that's sort of, I'll mention this as well, just, I kind of feel this is almost like a Frankenstein movie more than a remake of Robocop, because you have the corporation building this monster, and him ultimately going and fighting against the corporation. It's sort of like they're, you know, going against his creator, so to speak. Kind of has a connection
that you know, like, I guess of both, like, you know, the villagers, so to speak, are the cops, like that they kind of turn on, you know, kind of the monster stuff.
That's right, you're right, because they do that on the, they'll kind of gun him down, don't they? Do they do that in the remake? I don't remember there being a scene.
It was more like, you know, the other drones, right, that kind of turn on him and stuff.
Right.
You know, so I think that's the kind of an interesting kind of difference too, because in the original, it's the actual cops, like, kind of, you know, they're the ones who, like, you know, kind of like, you know, they initially say, you know, like, he's a cop too and stuff, so they resist. Yeah. But then ultimately they kind of like give in to the fact that, like, you know, now the corporation runs everything and stuff like that. Whereas, you know, in the remake, it's just, you know, it's just machines following, you know, kind of the actual instructions and stuff.
Yeah. And I think that's actually, ironically, one of the weaknesses of the Robocop remake, is that there's too many, sorry, I lost my video there. Yeah, one of the weaknesses, there's really not enough human interaction, actually.
Right.
You know, it's, in the original, it doesn't take long, and I think that's one of the strengths of it, is you see, as soon as he becomes Robocop, you see him dealing with an armed robbery, dealing with a rape, dealing with a hostage situation, one after the other. It's very clear. And these are all situations where you've got heightened human responses and emotions. And you just see him being completely kind of flat and robotic in each one of them. And it's funny, because that's this kind of thing of the truth of those situations. You know, in the armed robbery, you see, I think it's quite funny, you see the sort of the wife smiling gladly, like, you know, oh, he's come and saved us, but he's wrecked the entire store. You know, with the rape case, it's like she hugs him, oh, my hero, and he's just like, yeah, I'm going to contact a rape center, you've been through trauma. And she's like, okay. And then, you know, with the hostage crisis, which I think is, I just immediately thought of the elections this year, because he's there going, you know, I didn't accept this vote, I want to recount, and I want a better car, and I want the city to pay for it. Which I thought, you know, are we going to see a similar situation where they have to send Robocop in to get Trump if he doesn't accept the election results? But I mean, again, it's kind of like, you know, he just throws him out of the window and the politicians just splattered on the floor. It's like, okay, you know, this is what you get. But I mean, in this one, it was like, it's just him fighting robots. And of course, I guess this is also to do with the rating, right? It's a PG-13. So he's got a taser gun. There's no, it loses all of its bite, because you're not seeing the real human toll that this corporation is enacting, you know? So you're just seeing people getting tasered and fighting robots.
Right, I didn't think about that. That's an interesting point, though. Yeah.
So it's kind of, you know, they also had to tone it down, but it loses so much in that. It loses that shock value, and it loses, as I say, it loses the whole point of this corporate freedom, this regulation-free corporation that's been allowed to sort of dole out justice as it sees fit. So, yeah, that's a real weakness of it. And for me, just the whole ending was just so cliched, you know, just on top of the building, and there's a shootout. But it's kind of like going back to that Western thing. It's the high noon shootout but on a helicopter pad this time.
Yeah, but it just, like you said, it doesn't have the same impact, though. Even though, like, we care about the characters. I mean, certainly, you know, like, you know, there's the wife and, you know, son and stuff, and we really care about them, you know. But at the same time, though, I don't know, it still, like, loses something where, you know, because, I don't know, I guess, despite how much that's the case, it's just, I think it's just took us all that, looks like you lost video for a second. Yep.
Oh yeah, sorry, they're going back and back. Sorry.
It just, I think it's pretty much how drawn out things were, and it just kind of like that we know that that's coming, and but it's like almost like at that point, I'm guessing that that for a lot of the audience, they really just don't, I think a lot of the people are just lost by that point with the story and stuff like that. That even though that we do care about the characters, we like them and everything, but I just feel like it just doesn't somehow it just, even with the care, there just wasn't the stakes though at that point. On the one hand, we know that there's been this loss of humanity and stuff like that. And maybe that's part of the problem too, that we just even wonder what's really at stake with Alex Murphy himself at that point. Is it really, what's left of Murphy? Because in the original, the last thing he says is, when the old man asks who he is, he says, or what's his name? He says Murphy, because up to then he always says Robocop, and he finally says Murphy. And whereas in this case, he's Robocop, or he's Murphy turning into Robocop, and then it almost feels like at the very end, it's probably very little left of Murphy.
Yeah, they kind of turn him back a little bit, but it's and I suppose in a way you could say that's the same sort of bittersweet ending in that you don't actually know how much of him, the real him, is left. Right. So it's an interesting take on it. I mean, I think for me as well, there was, they made him able to jump really high and run really fast. And what's kind of cool about the original Robocop is that he moves so slowly that it's almost like I'm so tough that I can just casually stroll in and start shooting people, and it doesn't matter how many bullets you fire at me, I'm completely invulnerable. Whereas they lose all of that in this all sort of weird kind of sprinting, running through fields section. But in a way, they've downplayed that whole kind of power fantasy of the original. You really don't want to be this Robocop at all. Yeah. It's like there's no toy franchise that's coming after this, because you don't want to be the crying guy with his lungs and his head left and the family weeping, and that he's got to kind of try and console. It's just like, oh God, I just don't want to be this Robocop at all.
That's a great point. Certainly, I mean, it's not likely we're going to see a sequel to this one or a series of stuff. Whereas the original, there was Robocop 2, 3, and certainly I think like you said, kind of was made as a toy, but I imagine there was probably toys made from it, but likewise, I don't see a kid wanting to be a sad what's called cop that has only his lungs left and stuff.
I know, it's like in the original, it's part of I think is the kind of the juvenile fantasy of it is being it's so tough that you can walk into these things and you don't have to engage with any of the emotional dealings with it. It's just I'm going to shoot the bad guys and leave, and I don't give a crap, right? Whereas in this one, he's like, oh God, I've got a family to go to. It's just really, but I mean, I think it's one of those things. It's just a different movie in that respect. Yeah. You can maybe criticize it because it's unlike the original. If you were expecting an out and out kind of action movie, you're going to be disappointed. Yeah. But it's still pretty thought provoking, I think, as a movie. But it's very long as well, and it's very humorless. It's it's so little humor compared to the original.
That's true. Yeah, I didn't think about that.
I
mean, the only real humor is maybe bits of Samuel L. Jackson, which even then it's more just we're more laughing at the character he's playing and less at kind of the humor per se. I feel like. Yeah,
it's different movie, but ultimately not a terribly successful one, I would say. But thought provoking nonetheless, perhaps. I mean, I guess as well the night. Talk of the PG-13 rating. Of course, they use a night vision in it, which is again is a way of toning down the violence. You don't have to go and see the blood if you've got night vision on and things like this. So, it's I don't know. Can I say more about the 2014 version? Not much, really, to be honest with you. I'm still much more of a fan of the original, but I would say it's definitely one of the better remakes we've seen, in that it has something to sink your teeth into, so to speak. But yeah, not enough, I would say. How about you? Which one how did you find the remake? Did you enjoy it? Because I mean, I watched it when it came out, and this was kind of like my first rewatch, and I was like, oh, this is actually it's not too bad, really. I don't know what your impressions were.
Yeah, it's actually my first time watching it, believe it or not, and I did find it interesting and watchable and stuff like that. I think that for me, if I wasn't like kind of, and I almost feel like that's kind of a statement itself, that like there was probably nothing that kind of really drew me to watch it like when it first came out and stuff like that, other than the fact that like it's a Robocop movie, because I think even like I might have caught the trailer or something like that, and then where it just seemed like that like it was clearly a remake, and that they were just going to kind of do things a little bit different, and then that was it. And like to me, that was like kind of like, because I think for me what really drew me to the original was the Paul Verhoeven kind of take on the story, and I think this is kind of one of those cases that like where a filmmaker is doing more than putting the film fingerprint on kind of the story, but really kind of brings something really to the table. And in this one, like kind of the remake, I feel like it's competently made, like all the effects look great and stuff like that. I mean, stellar cast. I mean, we talked already about like kind of some of the key people and stuff like that.
Yeah.
The one other person, who we didn't talk about by name, so Abbie Cornish. She has this like kind of thing where like she's a really good actress, but like she's one of those actresses though that like is typecast as like the girlfriend, the wife, and like unfortunately I feel like she's gonna be that's gonna be her thing, so to speak, from here on out.
Yeah, I mean, there's no Lewis in this, which is a bit disappointing.
Right.
Sort of like foil to Murphy, and she's just kind of a weepy wife at home, really. Which is, I mean, understandable given what's happened to her husband, but it's pretty horrific. And I like the fact that she's sort of, I mean, she does kind of go and try and challenge them in the news media, which was interesting, I suppose. But still, it's a bit, I don't know.
Yeah,
it's a bit half-hearted, really.
Yeah, there's probably only so much there and stuff.
So the one thing we sometimes sort of neglect to ask is like, how would you have made it better?
That's a great kind of. I feel like one of the lost opportunities was the one we kind of mentioned though.
Yeah.
Where like just simply that in that situation that he was in a role where like he. I'm trying to remember the exact kind of moment we talked about.
It was just the satire in the news, really.
Yes,
that wasn't really good.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I would say there's one bit where they kind of hint at where they're like, oh, well, it's almost like, his mind is overriding the technology, and we don't know what's going on. It's almost like his soul is kind of controlling the computers. And it was a kind of like a bit of a cheesy throwaway line. But what I think I would have liked to have seen them go with that instinct and go with a much weirder kind of metaphysical Robocop. It would probably get even more destroyed by the critics. But I think that's an even weirder version of Robocop would have worked much better. I think because I mean, for me, Total Recall is like a really weird sci-fi movie, and it kind of, and we'll get into that when we get. But it's very kind of goes against grain, and I kind of think he should have gone more surreal. And I think maybe the whole memory things, and you could have thrown in is this real or is this simulation stuff in there? You could have done a whole bunch of stuff. Probably would have been a combination of like Lawnmower Man and Robocop or something like that, maybe.
Because certainly one of the things that we talk about with the kind of stripping away the humanity and stuff like that is the idea that he's like kind of no longer having these cortisone levels and all that kind of stuff. I mean, you got to figure that also kind of has a kind of Rashomon effect where he sees things like when he's more human and emotional, he sees things one way, right? And then as kind of that goes away, it would have been interesting to kind of show how like that perspective of maybe like the situation, like in other words, in the original we had the dream sequences and how kind of those were changed. Kind of we don't really know why those changed and stuff like that, other than that maybe the one was he was actually dreaming and sleeping, the other one he was awake, and somehow that affected it. So it would have been interesting kind of for in this one to kind of show like some scenes where where he was like kind of more human and how it looked, and then like when he was more machine and how that same sequence looks and stuff like that.
Yeah, because the first one is definitely, I mean, it's a search for identity in some respects.
Right.
It's what are my memories? Who am I? What am I? Whereas in this one, it's kind of like what's left is kind of the real overriding question. But I think what you could have done is you could have added like what is reality kind of spin on it. And maybe he could have just been Murphy the whole time, just sat in a chair in a simulation. And,
right.
You could have tried to do something like that. That would have probably really annoyed people even more. This is like one of those things where you can, and I think they did an admirable job of trying to make this an interesting movie, but you're just doomed to fail when you're doing something like as a stone cold classic as Robocop, which is like, probably in everyone's top 10 favorite sci-fi movies of all time. You're just, it's just, I feel sorry for the guy who directed it, a Brazilian director. I can't remember his name, but he did not do a lot after this. So I feel sorry for the guy, like I do Robocop.
Well, speaking of which, so for coming up, we'll be doing Total Recall, which will see a similar kind of story where one of Paul Verhoeven's best work and stuff, and it's remade, and so it definitely will ask some of the questions like, okay, how do you remake like something that is almost iconic as an 80s sci-fi and stuff. So that's coming up, and in another future episode we'll be kind of looking at the Watchmen series and versus like the original movie. So that's actually one that besides the Black Lives Matter, it has a lot of different kind of real relevance and connections, and we'll talk about that. So once again, I'm John Chang with Dad Edmonds. Thanks for watching, and we will see you next time.